So there we go. Okay, so let's lower the volume all the way on the side of your phone. And then I think we all set with the echo. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Aura Vasquez. Welcome to Aura's virtual town halls. This space I have created for us to have a conversation about current events, politics, and other things that can empower and enhance our community to act and to be better. This is the last week of a 3-part series that I partnered up with the Drug Policy Alliance to talk about drug decriminalization, harm reduction, and the post-legalization of cannabis in California. So today we have back California's drug policy manager, Armando Gudiño, who is someone that has been working on this issue for many, many years. And the conversation today is about decriminalization. So thank you, Armando, so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Thank you. Thank you for having me back, and for inviting us to have this conversation with you. It's been fun.
Yeah, of course. So I always like to start for the audience to get to know a little bit about who you are and how and why you're doing this work. So if you can just tell us how did you ended up working briefly, how did you ended up with the Drug Policy Alliance, and what is it that is moving you to do this work?
Well, I've been in the area of policy now for quite some time, and in terms of Drug Policy Alliance, actually, I was first introduced way back in '96 when they first worked on the Proposition 215 to legalize medical marijuana. And back then, working through a colleague at the Velasquez Institute who first brought me in as a junior analyst back way long when I had a lot more hair on the top and not as much on the front. And 20 plus years later, I came to DPA about 8 years ago, having worked with them in the 2010 initiative, and a few years later they invited me to join them and became the resident fellow for the organization based in Los Angeles.
Beautiful. So I think it's important to let people know how we end up doing this work, because especially for me, one of the reasons why I have supported the decriminalization of illicit drugs in general, not just cannabis, is because of what I experienced personally on the war on drugs in my own country, in Colombia, and how that was a big, as a result, my family and I ended up in this country. And sometimes people don't think about those repercussions when we think about international policy or even domestic policy, for that matter. So I wanted to first start asking you, there's a lot about legalization and there is a lot about decriminalization. So share with us what is decriminalization, and maybe later also introduce what the difference between those two are.
Well, it's actually kind of easy, right? So decriminalization entails the elimination of all punitive, abstinence-based, coercive approaches to drug use. What it does is that it eliminates the criminal penalties for drug use and possession, as well as the criminal penalties for possession of equipment used for the purposes of introducing drugs into your own body, right? To where, for example, legalization is actually includes all of that, but goes a step further and provides a regulatory framework, a regulatory infrastructure for limits on use, sales. It puts forward licensing requirements, quality controls, consumer protections, taxation, of course, and even advertising restrictions, very much to what we have now developed with legal cannabis, regulated cannabis in California. And, it's not new. We've seen examples of this type of regulation exists within the framework of substances most notably with tobacco and alcohol, for example. So decriminalization removes the penalties. The idea is that you shouldn't go to jail for consuming, having the actual product or even the equipment, especially when it's for personal consumption. And it really kind of functions on a premise that you need to treat some of these issues, especially if they're problematic drug use, through a public health lens and not through the criminal justice, in part for the simple reason that by every measurement, ahora, by every metric that you look at, that you apply to this conversation, simply put, the idea of using the criminal justice system to address drug consumption, drug possession, especially petty drug consumption, petty drug possession in this country, as a policy has simply failed, right?
Yeah.
It has failed. Most notably, and this is something that in my community, in the drug policy community, we use it on a regular basis. It's our mantra, right? The war on drugs, right? And the war on drugs has failed in particular. So we need to start, I think I shared this the last time I was with you, and I enjoy saying this because sometimes it's the simplest interpretations that really help people understand it. We've been fighting the war on drugs for 40 years. We've spent $1 trillion. We've incarcerated millions of people. And yet, again, by any measurement or metric, all its intended goals have not been met, not even one of them.
All.
So how's that working out for us? It's not. And of course, the alternative is, magic to do away with drugs. That doesn't exist. And then lastly, is, looking at alternative ways of not only policy and laws, but really challenging ourselves as individuals and the perceptions and ideas that have allowed us to place judgment, to support criminalization, etc. Over the years. We need to start changing all facets of this conversation.
Absolutely. And last week we talked about how stigma and how we still believe that people that abuse drugs are not people that are sick, but they are criminals. It's just like what you're saying. So that doesn't, not including decriminalization is also a public health issue, because then a lot of our jails are full of people that are abusing drugs for whatever reason they are. Maybe they have mental illness, maybe they have emotional issues, maybe they have trauma. And our jails are full of people that are not really criminals, but are actually sick.
And that's, I'm glad you bring that up, because that is very, very key to this. Any and all decriminalization policies of drugs, of drug use, needs to be considered as a core component of what is any public health strategy in general, right? That has to be a part of that, because again, if somebody has a problem with drugs, if somebody has a serious problem with drugs, we don't need to put them in jail. Putting them behind bars, where more often than not, it's actually easier to get drugs, in a space where there is no oversight of any sort. That's not the solution. And this is where this country has gone astray. We set out many years ago to attempt to moralize a personal act, and in doing so, specifically targeted communities of color, specifically targeted poor communities, specifically targeted some of the most underserved communities. And then today we include immigrants, and it's a policy that continues to fail. So we need to look at it from a whole different perspective, and that perspective has to be a public health strategy. Absolutely.
And something else that is worth bringing in is that we're already dealing with a law enforcement system that is inherently racist and discriminatory. So then the war on drugs is just only exacerbating that even more. And later on, we're going to talk about who is affected and more in depth. But I want to invite folks that are watching in the stream to post your questions and your comments on the comment box, or ask your questions with the question symbol next to the comment box, and make them Sure, so that we can read them and Armando and I can answer, or well, Armando will answer them better
and
than
and
me.
and, and be nice. Yeah, and
But
I
we want to,
jokingly say that because it is a difficult topic.
it is.
I mean, I can tell you, having worked on marijuana law and policy for many, many years, over the years, dating back to when, this was a very, young conversation around marijuana, for example, especially in my community, in the Latino community. I can't tell you how many times I was disowned. I was kicked. I was once kicked out of a presentation in a community in the Central Valley. We won't say where. It wasn't Fresno, and and they literally came in and said, "How dare you come in here and talk about legalizing, cannabis?" And I was run out of town in a rather
Oh yeah.
aggressive manner. So
Oh
it is
yeah,
a
yeah,
difficult
yeah.
conversation. People have to wrap their heads around this idea.
That is definitely a lot of that in like the Latino community and in other communities. But why is criminalization then the problem? And we're igniting this conversation. The Drug Policy Alliance has a report around it's the time for the U.S. to decriminalize use and possession of drugs. So we want to talk a little bit more about that. And in the report, you guys talk about why criminalization is a problem. So can you
Right.
touch a little bit about why criminalizing possession and use of illicit drugs in general is a problem?
Well, here's the thing, Aura. There's a lot of different factors to this, but most importantly and most concerning, among the most concerning for us, is the issue of mass incarceration, right?
Right.
Criminalization of drug possession has been one of the major drivers of arrest in the United States. Data has shown us that each year, on average, give or take a few 100,000, maybe 1.5 million folks are arrested for drugs.
Yeah.
This is more than all violent crimes combined. The overwhelming majority of that group of people, Aura, more than 80%, are actually arrested for possession only. We're talking the majority of 1.5 million people are arrested for merely possessing what is considered personal use. That is a very, very concerning statistic for us. When 80% is for possession only, what we found out from data, as we refer to the data from 2015 in our report, nearly 40% of those drug arrests, more than 570,000, were actually for marijuana possession.
Yeah.
Right.
And there is also a huge discrepancy in race and gender as well.
Yeah,
I was reading in the report that 13% of the U.S. population is African American, but use of drugs and drugs possessions is composed by 29% of those that are arrested by drug possession.
And what's worse, Aura, is that what we end up with is, we have a disproportionate number of people. We know statistically that when we look at Latinos, African Americans, and whites, we use and sell drugs roughly at the same level. Yet, because of an over-policing strategy this country employs, where they seek to over-police communities of color, they say in a rather systemic manner target these communities of color, leads to more arrests, more profiling, more arrests, more prosecutions. So you end up with the brunt of this, overwhelming percentage of people being arrested for petty drug crimes being taken by communities of color that oftentimes are in poor communities. And what happens is that as a result of this, now you have an entire generation that has not only been criminalized for petty drug use, that we know other communities use just as much, but they're now have been thrust into the vortex of the criminal justice system. And we know that, one of the big challenges with that has to do with the fact that oftentimes most people who are arrested for drugs don't necessarily end up in prison. And in fact, a disturbingly large amount of people end up being detained without even being charged.
Yeah.
Right? And that becomes a huge, huge, huge problem, because you have folks that oftentimes, if it is the father or the primary breadwinner, the primary income earner, now extracted from the family nucleus, and the collateral consequences, the direct and collateral consequences, end up being horrible,
Yeah.
and impacting everybody in the family.
Yeah. And this also, I mean, earlier I spoke about how this also affects immigrant communities
Very
so
much.
much. And even, I'm not talking about undocumented folks, I'm not talking about those. And some of those are also, of course, greatly affected. But even if you have a green card, and if you are, charged with possession or with use of drugs, you're getting deported. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, in fact, I'm glad you bring that up, because our office in Los Angeles here, the California Policy Office, in 2017 actually went after an existing law at the time, PC 1000, called Deferred Entry of Judgment. And what that did was that if you were arrested in California with a small quantity personal consumption of any kind of drug, oftentimes, if it was your first arrest, you would go before the magistrate or the judge, and a lot of people were able to qualify for this deferred entry of judgment, which allowed you to apply for a drug diversion program. However, what we found out was that an overwhelmingly large amount of people, you get arrested, you get a small amount of drugs because you were out partying with your friends, and now you find yourself in front of a judge the following morning with a public defender who is overwhelmed, and he's pushing this idea of deferred entry of judgment. You say, fine, go before the judge, and you plead guilty in order to qualify for the actual diversion program. But what happened was, for a lot of folks who were either in transition to acquire a change of status with regard to their immigration position, and or people with, let's say, a green card, haven't agreed to the terms of deferred entry of judgment and gone to diversion, in effect violated the terms of their agreement. And you found individuals who are now being, and then here's the worst part about that, is that according to the state of California, you actually fulfilled your duty, and the state would even vacate the actual conviction. However, it was then reported to the federal government, who then came back, and even though the state of California said you paid your debt, everything's fine, in fact, it's no longer even an issue with us, the federal government came in and said, well, you know what, F you, we're going to deport you anyway because you had a Xanax pill that was
we're taking you.
Right.
So, and that's an important distinction to make, because some folks in the comments were asking if there is a difference between drug possession and use policy between the states and the federal level.
Right. Well, each state has a varying. Each state takes this issue on its own. Oftentimes, at the state level, and this is actually one of the issues that this policy looks to mitigate. What constitutes personal use? There is no. There's a couple of experiments around the world in which they try and identify a level that's permissible per se. Most notably places like Portugal, that, believe it or not, actually has a very old list of what is allowed or what is considered. But ultimately, each state manages this accordingly. But, it's a good point that actually leads me to this issue of cost, right?
Yes.
In 2010, the Cato Institute and Harvard economists conducted a study, and the cost of policing low-level drug possession offenses exceeded $4.2 billion.
Yeah.
Again, $4.2 billion to police low-level, non-violent personal use consumption that results in the incarceration. You now have record. You now could potentially have lifelong consequences. You could end up in jail, all at this astronomical cost for what? Because somebody chose to consume a product that otherwise did not harm anybody. And look, let me make this very clear. By no means are we, and when I say we, we in the drug policy community are encouraging or wanting to enable people. No, to the
Right.
contrary. We simply say that you should have the right to self-determination and decide what you choose to put your body should be okay so long as it doesn't harm others in the process or during the course of.
Some folks in the comments were saying that, well, I'm also of the belief that people are going to do what they want. And the government or anyone, their parents, I mean, we were all teenagers. We know about this, And instead of making it punitive, can we make it easier so that people maybe can go and explore and try and then move on or get help or so? And instead of make it that it's gonna destroy your life. I have a new follower actually that constantly says that drugs didn't destroy his life, that the war on drugs destroyed his life. So it's an interesting point to think about. The other point that I want to bring up is that, especially in the states like California, where cannabis is legal, marijuana is legal, the difference between the state laws and the federal laws, and even the local laws can make it or break it for a business. And we have a big movement now of a public bank, because a lot of businesses cannot bank at the federal level, because at the federal level, cannabis is not yet to be legal, even though in California it might be, and in LA it might be, and in the county of Los Angeles might be as well. So, this is another thing to think about, that this is also generating revenue for our, for our city, for our communities too.
Right. No, and it's, you make an excellent point. And let me go back to something you started off with, because this is something that I think hits a lot of people on a very personal level. Every one of us in one form or another, whether directly by way of personal experience, whether by our relationships internally in our internal family, or by extension, have in fact been affected by drugs. The direct or collateral consequences. There's no denying that for some people, drugs has in fact led to a variety of problems or compounded problems. Some would say have ruined their lives. And while it's important to acknowledge these realities for some people, it's also important to remind ourselves that it's very rare that this happens in isolation. In other words, there are other mitigating circumstances, whether they be, experiences of trauma, emotional, psychological, physical. This is not a single issue challenge for most people who consume, and in particular, people who have problematic drug use. Right. So, I think that's important. And regardless if in fact your personal life has been impacted, I oftentimes find myself reminding people that, you need to look at what is the current proposal. In other words, if you are concerned that drugs ruin families, for example, right? Are you then willing to accept that by throwing people in jail is going to make this any different? And the answer is no, it's not. It's not going to do that. So, and I wanted to share that because I saw somebody make a reference to that.
Right.
And you do get a lot of that. Look, this is X, period, end of story. And that is part of the challenge that we're experiencing in this country. Absolutely. That we close off because of the stigma. We close off because of the trauma. We turn off the channel because we don't want to be reminded of these experiences. All the while, we know that the overwhelming majority of people who consume drugs, whether illicit or legal, do so for the necessity of addressing some sort of ailment and or recreationally, and the overwhelming majority do not develop problematic drug use.
Right. And yeah, I want to invite everyone that is watching to open their hearts and their minds and listen to our conversation to understand and to learn and to educate yourself, and to pause on your judgments for just 40 minutes that we're having these conversations, and learn a little bit about what the reality of things are. And again, I like to refer again to our teenager years, where we wanted to do what we wanted to do and we didn't listen, or whatever the case was. But I'm trying to tap into that feeling that we all had, that we knew better, and that we were curious and we wanted to try. And this is something really primal too. It's part of our brain being developed and such. And if you guys have questions that you want to ask, you can put them in the comments. I see some questions coming in. Keep the comments flowing. This is definitely a space for that, for us to learn, together. And to continue this conversation, we have talked about why criminalization is the problem. We talked about a little bit of even the finances of drug legalization, decriminalization. Why do you think decriminalization is the solution to our drug possession and use in the United States?
Yeah, so we discussed a few of the problems, right? And look, decriminalization starts to provide a roadmap for a number of solutions. First of all, by decriminalizing, it's going to reduce the number of people arrested, people incarcerated, and people who end up having their lives, torn apart by a justice system that ultimately not just affects them, but affects all components of the family.
The community as a whole.
Right.
We all pay taxes. Somebody's paying for the jail beds,
Right.
It affects all of us.
And you're right. It alleviates income-based disparities in the criminal justice system. If, in fact, we're over-policing certain communities, particularly communities of color, particularly immigrant communities, particularly low-income communities, where, as a result, we're disproportionately arresting more people, again, for same levels of consumption that other communities are consuming. This is going to alleviate that economic burden, decriminalization, because you eliminate those patterns, those impacts. So it makes it a cost-effective, approach to addressing issues of drug use in this country. A cost-effective measure that can, in turn, be used to address what's at the core of the problem, which is a public health issue. Right? If, in fact, we were to revise existing laws around the criminalization of petty drug use, petty drug possession, petty drug consumption, etc., and redirected some of those funds in a more responsible public health-centered approach, we would then, in turn, be able to provide further opportunities to address some of the problems that are at the core of these issues, right? Other issues include, creating opportunities for people who are using drugs to actually seek treatment. So instead of throwing them in jail, you now created an opportunity to seek help, right? And again, we've already seen time and again that throwing somebody behind bars does nothing, absolutely nothing for the pharmacological, the physiological, mental, social, emotional well-being of a person who oftentimes is using or over-consuming any type of illicit substance, including also legal substances, right? I mean, this country is still reeling from a very serious opioid epidemic, and let's be very clear, not everybody who consumes opioids is having a problem with it, but there are several, and we know this. And in fact, some of those numbers are increasing. And then, other things include, by decriminalizing, it's going to remove barriers to the implementation of evidence-based practices.
That's true.
Right? Harm reduction is an area that continues to grow and developing in California. And we need to start looking at that. One of the biggest harm reduction efforts that we've had has been around for quite some time. Every parent has thought about this at one point or another, and you touched on it a little bit. As young people, the issue of sex, When we tell our kids, when we teach our young people about the importance of safe sex, when we talk about the importance of condom use, that is a harm reduction measure.
Yeah.
Right? That is a harm reduction measure that seeks to mitigate the direct and collateral consequences of irresponsible,
sex. Intercourse.
Right. And, I pause on that, yet I've been talking about drugs for the last 20 years. But again, it's the same thought process in many regards. How do we start to develop, policies, ideas, programming that allows us to educate, empower communities and individuals to look at this issue from a very different lens, with intent of being more preventative, more, with intent of, intervention, prevention, and solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want to bring out this question that somebody asked, because I hear this often, and it kind of sounds like conspiracy, but I think it's plenty of evidence. So I wanted to, to ask you, but somebody's asking, did the U.S. government not introduce drugs in the undeserved communities of color? So the idea that the government introduced certain illicit drugs in communities of color.
Well, actually, that particular issue, and I'm always, I always cringe at some conspiracy theories. God knows there's a lot of them right now around COVID. But actually, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is far from it. We know, as a matter of fact, based on, countless evidence, in part due to investigative journalism, research, and other reliable sources, verifiable sources, that the U.S. government did, in fact, introduce by way of coercion, economic, out of a goal to make money, introduce drugs into many poor communities, particularly crack cocaine. That has been time and again, it's an issue that has been researched and, proven to be factual. The elements of the Secret Service agencies, particularly the CIA, did facilitate the importation of cocaine in an effort to fund an illegal war in Latin America, in particular in Nicaragua. So that, this is something that, over the years we've seen, other examples of where government, look at the examples of some of the foreign policies around drug eradication programs, where we know that they're being used, in places like Colombia and other places in America del Sur, Mexico, Plan Merida, where they're channeling billions of dollars into otherwise corrupt governments, and the money is not being used for its intended purposes, rather for repression and persecution of oftentimes human rights workers, among others. So, the government is as dirty as what they allege these drugs are for society. And yes, there is some element of truth to that. It can in fact lead to some challenges, but there is ample evidence that the government has played a key role in sustaining some of these operations. After all, if there's one very effective way of social control, is to introduce something that, if not, right.
Yeah, when I lived in New York, there was also conversations about that and how it destroyed Harlem and, a vibrant African-American community in the 1940s. So how do you feel about people that commit serious crimes due to drugs? They should be punished?
That's a great question. Listen, let me be very clear about that. If you're driving into town, with 3 tons of cocaine, I mean, I'm sorry, brother. This is not even a debate.
This is not a conversation we're having here, guys.
Yeah, this is neither a debate, much less is it a point of advocacy. No, listen. Our concern has everything to do with a couple of very basic, rights. First and foremost, an individual should not be regulated. You should not be told what you can consume, do, to your own body, so long as, again, in the process of doing so, you don't harm others. And if, in fact, there's infrastructure for that, right? But no, by no means are we encouraging the opportunity to just kind of do at will. No, our concern are, the largest drivers of incarceration, right? The petty drug crimes that, as we shared earlier, are, in some cases 60, 70, 80% of what constitutes those that are being thrown in jail and really having their lives ruined, when in fact they committed no violent crime, they did nothing of that nature. So, if you're driving around with a bunch of kilos of cocaine or heroin, you very likely violated a lot of laws. Yeah, no, we're not supporting that whatsoever.
Is if you're smoking a joint, or if you are, I don't know, at a party taking ecstasy. I don't know what the other things like. I mean, there are a million boutique drugs out there that rich people do at parties, at fancy backstage, and that sort of thing. And you don't see them waiting in jail for their court to see their judge. This is the kind of this disparity that we're trying to point here.
I used to share with folks when I used to go on the discussion circuits around cannabis. I oftentimes I heard people would ask me variations of that question, and why we wanted to legalize cannabis, for example. And I oftentimes found myself, telling people that, we know that white, black, and Latino consume at the same level, but yet you're arresting black and Latino, which in part tells us at a higher rate, which tells me that there is an unequal application of the law. So if you, as a justice system, are incapable of eliminating the racial tendencies, the racist activity that leads to this, then as a result, people like myself sometimes want to equal the playing field and ensure that nobody gets arrested unjustly. And in the process, put it in a regulatory framework and allow it to be taxed and all the other good things. Because look, Aura, here's the thing. This can be said about all illicit drugs, right? They're not going anywhere.
No, they're not going anywhere. That is the thing, guys. It's like, we talked about this the first week about Dance Safe. Remember, we talked about Dance Safe and how raves and parties. I mean, I don't know how that's gonna turn out after COVID-19. We don't know what's gonna happen. But young people, and not young people are gonna do drugs because that's what they want to do. And the war on drugs have not stopped them. Making them, schedule them hasn't stopped them. Make them expensive hasn't stopped them. So let's just utilize that approach of harm reduction, which is, if people are going to do that, let's make sure that they don't die, and let's make sure that they don't go to jail for just being at a party, using recreational drugs, instead of, ending in jail for that and destroying their lives. When I know some people are here saying that this is not about race and color, but it is, because we have a law enforcement system that is inherited racist.
This is all about race and color. It's all about race, color, and class. And drugs is just the tools by which they're going after these particular groups. Look, since the inception of the war on drugs, now 40 years later, when we talk about, production, manufacturing, distribution, importation, exportation, consumption, and even since then, we've created a few new ones. All the indicators have gone up. So this is an issue that isn't going anywhere. I used to tell parents about the marijuana conversations. I used to oftentimes say to parents...
Wait, hold on a second, Armando. I think people cannot hear you. So maybe move your headset.
Can you hear me now?
Let us know if you can hear. Let us know if you can hear Armando now.
Okay.
If you can hear Armando, put a little heart. So we can continue. Okay, I think you're good. I see the hearts coming through. Yeah.
Okay, so as I was saying, so when we look at it over the course of the war on drugs in the last 40 years, all the indicators production, manufacturing, distribution, importation, exportation, consumption, use, sales, all the indicators have gone up, which tells us that the policies that were put in place have done absolutely nothing. And while many of us, especially those of us that, look, I've been advocating and helping to some degree regulate some of these and decriminalize others. I'm not a consumer. I don't consume, not even cannabis. I don't consume any of that. To me, it's an issue of social justice. When we talk about decriminalization, when we talk about regulation and legalization of cannabis, this is one of the largest social justice issues in the history of this country, and we're able to mitigate a lot of those challenges by addressing the tools by which they've gone after us, and that is drug laws and policy. So that's what we're doing.
Absolutely. And I think the other point that we're trying to make here is that instead of treating people that are abusing drugs as criminals, let's treat them as who they are, which is people that need support, help, and that are sick. Drug addiction and in general is considered a public health issue. So instead of putting everyone in jail for abusing or using drugs, let's just figure out a way for them to get better. And we talked very briefly the first week that I had you on the show. We talked very briefly about homelessness. And how this is also a huge issue, because a lot of people have the stigma that all homeless are like just getting loaded and drinking beer and doing drugs on the streets. And a lot of them in the system, because we don't have a good way to also deal with our homelessness population, our unsheltered and unhoused population, instead of treating them as who they are, which is people with mental health and mental illness.
Right. Yes, and the fact of the matter is, you oftentimes hear folks who will say, you see somebody who unfortunately doesn't have a home, is living on the streets, perhaps is not as well kept as the rest of us, and you oftentimes hear the default allegation, well, they're probably on drugs, or it was drugs that led them there, and we know that oftentimes it's the loss of income, trauma, and a whole variety of other issues that lead to issues of homelessness. And drugs oftentimes is a secondary to that. Many of us, whether we are obsessed with the gym or, overconsume alcohol or, pharmaceutical or illicit drugs, many of us self-medicate in a variety of different ways.
And many of us have doctors that prescribe drugs at our leisure, and that's also problematic.
And and it can turn into a serious problem. So again, this is why these conversations become so important, because we have to start looking at all the facets of this, start to deconstruct the perceptions, to reorganize, the causes in terms of what we think leads to what. I saw in one of the comments somebody who said, we get it, but the problem is actually what happens when somebody is on drugs and they hurt others. And listen, we acknowledge that. We recognize that is in fact a problem. This happens on a daily basis, unfortunately. You have people who are drunk driving and commit accidents and unfortunately, harm others in the process. And this is even with a regulatory framework, which says you can't drink and drive, you can't do this, don't do that. It's structured. And, right now for some of these other illicit substances that, again, are not going anywhere, we're not going to people are not going to stop doing them. We're not going to stop doing it, right? We need to start to find ways to regulate some of these issues. And decriminalization is a first step towards stopping some of the most catastrophic consequences, which includes over-incarceration, persecution of communities of color. And then from there, we start building towards some of these other broader, bigger questions of what can it look like in a framework of regulation, for example.
So let me ask you this, Armando. What are some of the places around the country and around the world? I see some people here, for example, talk about, I like the Portugal model of legalization. Some of the people in the comments here on Instagram also talked about that. What are some of the states, let's just start with home, what are some of the places that are doing this somewhat right, or that are doing really, that are the model for us to follow?
You know, I think the most noticeable model, as somebody pointed out, is in fact Portugal. You know, Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001.
Wow.
And more than a decade later, drug use has remained actually about the same, give or take.
Wow.
You know, but, and this is a very, very important, very large but. Drug use remain pretty much the same, but arrest, incarceration, disease, overdose, and other harms that come with the direct and collateral consequences of drug use have all gone down.
Wow.
Right. And, you know, Portugal, they, till this day, perhaps provide the best model for this. You know, and what they did, look, their policy kind of grew out of a reaction of what they saw was an escalation of problematic drug use, right? What most people oftentimes refer to by using the stigmatized term of drug addicts. And, you know, and in particular, what motivated Portugal was this rise in unsafe injection practices that were leading to increased transmissible diseases, impacts on public safety, public health. And what they did is they took a lot of that problem that was being addressed through the criminal justice system and transferred the responsibilities into the public health system, right? So what they did is in 2001, they enacted this comprehensive form of decriminalization that eliminated the penalties for low-level possessions of all drugs, reclassifying them as activities that led to administrative violations, penalties, right? And as a result, they deliberately started to address these issues through the public health system. Right. So if in fact you're busted with, you know, a gram of cocaine that you are using for personal use, instead of sending you to jail and to see a judge, you're now going to go before oftentimes a panel of individuals that includes public health officials who, upon a series of consultations and discussions, they develop an assessment of what your level of use and impact is. And then actually, oftentimes, you'll be given an opportunity to participate in drug prevention, education programs, rehab, as we know it, you know, and enter into a treatment program, oftentimes actually funded by the state, because you now redirected funds, right? So it is the ultimate harm reduction model. You take a person, if you busted them with dope, and after an evaluation, if you determine that they have a serious problem, maybe a problem, an emergent challenge, or just recreational, based on that analysis, you then levy an action, and that action more often than not results in the opportunity being given to you to actually get medical assistance and support and addressing what could be a problem. This is why Portugal has led the way in that direction. They completely removed that criminal justice component.
Any states in the United States are doing anything similar? I see in the comments somebody saying that in Seattle they have supervised injection sites, but any state that is kind of following this model or that is seriously thinking about harm reduction and also decriminalization of drugs?
Yes, in fact, you know, I'm happy to say, I'm proud to say that, you know, my colleagues and I here in California have been, you know, for the last several years advancing the idea of creating safe consumption sites. It's actually something that legislatively we've been working very hard at doing. A safe consumption site, which has our programs have been pioneered in places like Canada. Germany has had them for more than 20 years. Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the world, is a place where you can come in with your pre-obtained drugs and actually consume them in a place that's supervised by medical professionals, where we can provide assistance and ensure that there is no overdose death. They're also commonly referred to as overdose prevention rooms, right? And yeah, somebody mentioned Seattle. Actually, up in the Northwest, in Oregon, there is right now an initiative which would make the first, if it passes, and I'm cautiously optimistic for my dear colleagues in the drug policy reform movement up there, a measure 110, which is a measure that expands access to drug treatment and recovery services for anyone who wants or needs them, and is paid by existing marijuana tax money. Remember that they legalized and regulated cannabis for adult use. And what that does, and this is a measure that, decriminalizes and redirects opportunities for folks to address issues of in the area of addiction medicine. It provides harm reduction services, a whole variety of programs for people in that arena.
Yeah. I see in the comments also some people are saying that they're working on injection. Let me see, injection safe injection sites in Portland. So I guess some states are starting to get a little more open and serious about decriminalization and just harm reduction in general.
Yes, I mean, this is an emerging movement. And look, this goes back to something that's happening, not just, it goes back to what's happening in other areas of this country related to the call for reform. The call for reform, in order for it to be really successful, is going to have to include a lot of these other components, right? As we look to defund police, as we look to reprioritize how we address some of these issues relative to law enforcement and the general public and so on, so too comes the opportunity for us to take a radical approach for some, at looking at how we address drugs in America, drugs in this country. Again, 40 years later, what we've been doing has simply not worked. So we are long overdue to start looking at this issue from a whole different perspective. And just as we're saying, look, is it possible that we can totally re-envision how policing is done in America? Absolutely. It's absolutely possible, and it should happen. And as we're doing that, we should also be looking how policing is used to, in a systemic way, utilize this issue of drug laws to target and incarcerate communities of color. And when we start to do that, we're going to start looking at these other issues. What can we do to help people who have drug issues or problematic drug use? What can we do to employ measures of intervention, prevention? And one of my personal favorites over the last several years has been the emergence of a new approach to drug education.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Drug education
approach. Some folks in the comments are asking how they can get involved at the local level, in the war on drugs, or just how they can support these efforts so that they can get more educated and support the efforts of the Drug Policy Alliance in terms of decriminalizing and educating and all the good things that you're mentioning. Education is key, yeah.
And thank you for that, because look, more than ever are there opportunities, right? Today, as we transition, and look, here's a perfect example. 8 months ago, a lot of these conversations, this presentation would likely have been in a venue with some coffee in the back, some donuts, some pan dulces, something. Yeah. And as everybody literally around this little rock we call Earth begins to move into this, interwebinet sphere, so too can those who want to support efforts to reform drug policy and even projects like, decriminalization. We are beginning to explore this issue as possibly a legislative issue in California. We have had these conversations. for transparency. I think this is part of the beginning of that. Let's start talking about what this can look like. Is it possible?
Yeah.
So drugpolicy.org is a great place to start. That's our website, www.drugpolicy.org. There you can see all our resident states and where we're doing, what we're doing and where, including work at the national level. And you can also link up with us at the California office. We're based in Los Angeles. We always are looking for folks who want to learn more, need information, use us as a resource. Of course, media and other projects like this. But more importantly, if you just want to maybe share information.
Read the report. I posted
the report.
Posted in the link. I'm gonna put it in the link in my bio, guys, so you can go in there. And I also will add the drugpolicy.org website to the link in my bio. So learn about the report. Get in touch. I tagged Armando in all of the posts, so go ahead and send him a message and ask him what to do. It's on the comments. So I mean, we can have a show to talk about these issues that are important. And right now what we need is to organize, and this is maybe why we're having these conversations.
A shameless plug for our program, Safety First, New Approach to Drug Education. I'll connect you with my colleague who helped develop this program. And, it's a drug education curriculum that we're making available for folks in a controlled school setting and also outside of school setting. And, simply put, it's an approach that removes fear and intimidation as a tactic, and, provides opportunities for new engagement, new conversations with our kids. Why? Because, like it or not, our kids will be exposed,
of course,
to drugs.
We were all teenagers. We all know.
And especially us in the Latino family, mom and dad used to say, "Hola, verás."
Exactly.
Wait till you get home.
Culturally, it's so different the way that we treat all these issues. But I just got a few seconds before Instagram kicks me out of the chat. So I want to thank you so much for all of this knowledge and all this amazing information that you have shared. Please go to drugpolicy.org. Go to the link in my bio. Share this talk with your friends. Let them know that there is a group that is really thinking about drug use in a different way, that there's no shame, that that we need to treat this with a public health lens instead of a criminal lens. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you can come back and we can do another series when some other exciting things. Let us know how we can support you, and I'll be happy to share with my community as well.
Thank you. And if anybody has any questions, I can be reached at agudino, AGUDINO, @drugpolicy.org. Join the other 100,000 emails I haven't responded to. Just kidding. I'll respond.
Instagram and he will be great. Armando,
thank you
so much. Keep being amazing, and we talk very soon.
Thank you all. Thank you all for tuning in, and thank you for doing this, Aura.
All right. Bye-bye.